Hello and welcome to Independence Live. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. In this programme, we want to look at land, Scot-LAND. Most of us in Scotland feel some pride at the extraordinary beauty of this country's rural landscapes, but many of us who are huddled in the central belt have little or no opportunity to enjoy these amazing spaces, and few of us who do have much understanding of the huge problems these areas and the communities who live and work there are facing. Environmental degradation, the terrible loss of biodiversity, and the absurd concentration of ownership, wealth and control, alongside poverty and neglect, that's characterised Scottish land for centuries. And yet the possibilities offered by this natural resource are also extraordinary for the future of Scotland and indeed for the well-being of our planet. So, to try to throw some light on these vital issues, we're very happy to have with us Ailsa Raeburn, who's the chair of Community Land Scotland, and Alan McCombes from the John Muir Trust. Thank you so much for being with us. Just so that our audience can understand a little bit where you're coming from to approach these problems, maybe each of you could tell us very, very briefly what your organisation is and what it does. Ailsa?
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. I'm the chair of Community Land Scotland, so we're the national membership organisation for community landowners. So our members stretch all across Scotland and the islands. It's not just land they own, but a huge variety of different assets. So they'll own the local shop or the pub, or they'll own housing, lighthouses, big tracts of forestry, whole islands, estates, every type of asset you can think of. And communities over the last 100 years, because we're on 100 years of community ownership now, have worked really hard to bring into ownership assets that are important to them. Whether that's to address a particular opportunity or to address a threat in our area, or to save some services or develop facilities. So that's communities right across Scotland. I'm also chair of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust, and the residents of Egg bought their island in 1997, so owned over 25 years now, and since acquiring the island, they were the first community to generate their own 24/7 power from renewables, and they've got global attention as a result of that. People coming from all over the world to love seeing what they do. They've also got their own housing and farms, and they run various other assets on the island as well. So quite a broad spectrum of activity going on there. Hopefully we get a chance to talk about it today. Thanks, Ian.
Definitely, yeah, thanks very much. That's great. Yeah, we'll certainly come back to a lot of those issues. Alan, what about the John Muir Trust?
The John Muir Trust is a membership organisation, but it's individual members whose mission is to protect and restore wild places for the benefit of nature, for the benefit of local communities who live in and around wild places, and for the benefit of the nation as a whole. Now, that might seem quite straightforward, but it takes us in a quite a complex range of different activities and relationships. So we're involved in land management. We own and manage Ben Nevis and a number of other big mountain and coastal properties, mainly in the Highlands, but in other parts as well, for a bit further south. We're involved in science and ecology, and we work with academic institutions and scientists. We are involved with education, working with schools, educating young people on nature and the benefits of it. We work with recreational organisations such as Mountaineering Scotland and Ramblers Scotland. We work with communities, including Community Land Scotland. We work very constructively with Community Land Scotland and with a number of individual community landowners. We're also involved in campaigning, policy, just developing ideas, and trying to get these ideas driven forward. And I think one of the points, we also work with other environmental organisations. One of the things I think the John Muir Trust stands out for is that straddling of different sectors, and at the heart of what we do is environmental justice combined with social justice. That's what we're all about.
Thanks, Alan. That's great. I'd like to start by trying to tease out a bit more what the nature of the problem is with the land in Scotland. And we mentioned the highly concentrated pattern of ownership. Where does that come from, and why is it still an issue well into the 21st century? Alan, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, I think it's quite a complex mix of reasons, which include history, geography, politics, economics, culture, economics, and we have notoriously one of the most concentrated land ownership patterns in Europe. Alongside that, we have an extremely imbalanced population distribution, which you alluded to in your introduction when you said about people living in urban areas being kind of disconnected from land. That's partly because Scotland is one of the most heavily, and people associate Scotland with mountains and lochs and coasts and marine areas, etc., etc. But it's actually perhaps the most urbanised, or certainly one of the most urbanised countries in Europe, where the vast majority of our population live in a tiny fragment of our landmass. Something like 80% of our people live in something like 4 or 5% of our land. Scotland is the most sparsely populated country in Europe, apart from those countries in Scandinavia that extend into the Arctic Circle. The Highlands, one region of Scotland, the size of Belgium, where the population density is lower, 10 times lower in some cases than the 3 most sparsely populated counties of England. So we have a kind of really skewed situation in Scotland between concentrated land ownership, seriously imbalanced demography and distribution of population, and alongside that, again, you alluded to it in your introduction, we have a highly degraded landscape. It's beautiful, starkly beautiful mountains, lochs, but that beauty conceals severe environmental degradation, ecological impoverishment, and a lack of life, both human life and wildlife, vegetation, the lot. And so we have a problem in our hands of the state of our land, the ownership concentration of our land, and the distribution of our population, the depopulation of huge areas of our land. And these 3 are tied very closely together.
Let me just bring in Ailsa a moment. Ailsa, why is that serious concentration of land ownership? Why do you see that as a problem?
Alan's completely right. It's linked into, there's a real complexity of factors here. Obviously, the clearances a couple of 100 years ago, everyone wants to look forward, but if you look at the landscape, you can see the impact of that still in the landscape today. If you go to some of the places that Alan's talking about, you see ruins everywhere. And of course, there were people in all of these landscapes 200 plus years ago. And there were different ways of managing those landscapes 200 plus years ago, which were much more environmentally sound. What's happened over the last 200 years is there's been this concentration, which is getting worse and worse. The Land Commission report that came out last week talked about further threats to further concentration of ownership of land, because not only, it's a limited resource, we're not making any more of it. Values are constantly rising, so it's a great place to put your money. There's a lot of financial speculation in land at the moment. And of course, we've got this new land use, carbon and carbon sequestration, which has recently come into being, which is putting further pressure. There's a huge amount of interest in Scotland's rural land. As Alan's quite rightly said, it's about environmental and social justice. So people can't get houses, they can't get access to land, communities can't get access to land. If you look at what's been happening in terms of population in most of the rural areas, is going down and it's continuing to go down. And there's huge threats which are now recognised by the Scottish Government around depopulation. And in fact, it's only where communities have actually acquired estates or acquired islands or assets that population demographic is changing. You're getting more young people into those areas. So land ownership is obviously about wealth and it's about power. No matter what anybody says, the ownership of land confers wealth and it confers power. And the more and more that is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, then the impact that has on how Scotland wants to develop both environmentally and socially and in community terms is going to be impacted. So there's an opportunity at the moment to do something about it, but that time is almost gone.
Ailsa, let me just stop you there a moment, because I want to definitely come back to that about what we're going to do about it. But I have a doubt here, because I have this image of the way that landed elite developed over 2-3 centuries or even more, in Scotland. And what I'm not clear about is whether it's really that pattern that has strangely persisted right into the 21st century, or whether these new things that you mentioned, like, the sort of financialization of land and the sort of, the new sort of market for kind of second homes and all those kinds of things, and carbon sequestration, all these sort of relatively modern things have sort of like got implanted on top of that, or whether they've kind of replaced that old kind of semi-feudal version of land ownership, or what exactly has changed and what hasn't changed.
They've exacerbated existing issues. So you've got that structural inequality in terms of who owns land in Scotland. You've got a very small number of people that own huge tracts of land. And then on top of that, you've got the issues where things do come to the market. You've got a much hotter market now. You've got people who are looking to acquire land for speculative purposes or for carbon purposes, or for obviously timber at the moment. Prices in timber are really high. So you've got people piling into that type of market. So you've got this underlying structural problem in that you've got very few people owning big chunks of land. And then overlaying on that, the market for any land that does become available and the values for that land is getting more and more. The prices are rising hugely. Again, I'll come back to the Scottish Land Commission report about how prices are rising, but also demand for land is rising. So what that's meaning is your small crofter or your farmer or community cannot access land at all. And I suspect it's even impacting on organisations like Alan's and other organisations in that sector who want to acquire land to improve it. They're not able to act in this market either. So that's why regulation is important.
Alan, do you want to come back on that before I take it?
Yeah, I totally agree with the points that Ailsa made there. There's always been this, what Tom Johnson, a former Secretary of State for Scotland, called Our Noble Families, when he wrote a book, just exposing the connections between the aristocracy, feudalism and land ownership. That's always been part of the equation in rural Scotland, and it still is to this day. Something like 25% of big estates have been there have been in the hands of the same family for over 500 years. But you've also had commercialisation of land, and that's not just a new thing, because the Highland clearances were driven for commercial gain, the flooding of millions upon millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of sheep replacing people. And that was at a time where wool prices and prices of meat were sky high, and industrialists from the Central Belt and England put big money into the Highlands to capitalise on that economy. But then you had a strange, just as the sheep economy was beginning to dwindle away because of importation of wool and just different technological changes, along came Queen Victoria, who took up sports shooting, and you had the rise of the traditional Victorian shooting estate, which was embraced enthusiastically by the old aristocracy, but it was also embraced, and it is to this day, by, if you like, the nouveau riche. Back then, every big industrialist wanted to get a sporting estate in Scotland, not so much to make money, but because it was the ultimate status symbol. It was conspicuous consumption writ large. It was the equivalent of buying a football club or having a private jet or a private yacht, and that's still the case to this day. So you might have oil sheikhs from the Middle East, Russian oligarchs, Scandinavian entrepreneurs, City of London bankers owning big estates in Scotland, not to make money. They do that not to become rich, but because they are already rich in some cases. And now you've got another added layer, and that is people moving in to acquisition of land as a kind of futures market, because they think it's going to become valuable for carbon sequestration. And so there's a whole combination of things, and there's no one, all three of these. There's other elements to land ownership as well, but these three big elements are causing serious, are reinforcing the concentrated land ownership pattern that we've had for centuries.
I was reading some. Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Ailsa. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, just building what Alan's saying there. This is like the carbon market and the financial futures market is not new in terms of Highland land ownership and rural land ownership in Scotland. It's just part of this sort of narrative arc that started with sheep, and then it went to the sporting estates, and then it went to Sitka, and then it went to renewables, and now it's carbon. And it's all part of this pattern of people seeing rural land in Scotland as a way to extract wealth from Scotland. So none of this money stays locally, it all leaves the area. And that's why we have depopulation and a poor economy and the environmental degradation and everything that Alan's talking about. So this is new at the minute, carbon, but it's actually just the latest in a long line, which has led to the whole issue around concentration of wealth, which is why it needs to be cracked.
I want to come back later on to this question of carbon sequestration, because I think there's an obvious dilemma there for environmentalists and people, climate justice movement and so forth. But I was reading some of Andy Whiteman's work on this thing about Scotland's land, and one of the things that struck me in his book was how that pattern of land ownership and the elite that controlled it was really worried about Scottish devolution back in the 80s and 90s, because they they thought that was suddenly going to impinge and change their kind of the power equation, I suppose, basically, that they would no longer be able to hang on to that those privileges in the same way, or they might not be. So, I mean, has devolution changed the arithmetic here? Has it changed the shape of things or not? And if not, why not? Either of you.
For me to go first? Yeah. I think, yeah, there has. I mean, when you've got these entrenched interests, everything is a threat. So devolution was a threat, and then every land reform bill that's come along since then. So I think there have been 3 bills, and there's 3 acts, and there's a bill slated for this year. So it's all a threat to those vested interests and those entrenched interests around protecting that wealth and that power. But devolution has allowed Scotland to move away from the English position on land ownership. Obviously, the first Land Reform Act included the right to roam, which has been hugely impactful. And it has established both legislative and financial support for communities to acquire assets. And it did introduce the Land Commission, who has a responsibility to take forward further land reform. things like the land rights and responsibility statement. So so it has moved the dial on land reform and community ownership, but there's still a long way to go, because we can see that the actual underlying patterns of ownership have not been hugely impacted in terms of percentages of ownership. So yes, there is now an ability to talk about these things, and communities are much more ambitious and aspirational. The land reform isn't just about community ownership.
You mentioned the Land Reform Act. I mean, that's obviously a key part of the legislation that's on the table. Tell us a bit more about that, Alan. I mean, what is being proposed? Is it adequate?
I think the point that Ailsa makes about devolution, what we should remember is that Scotland has control over land and environment. Doesn't have the same fiscal powers that it probably needs to really tackle ownership. Does have powers to tackle management and land use. Is far more powerful in that area than it is in relation to the actual ownership pattern. I think we should also agree with Ailsa that devolution has made changes. There was nothing happening in Scotland. Land in Scotland was a running sore, and it still is, but there has been progress over these past 23 years, 24 years of devolution. The land reform bill that's currently being discussed can appear from the outside to be a little bit technical, a little bit dry, because it's dealing with processes, it's dealing with land use, it's dealing with what they call land rights and responsibilities, land management plans. But underlying that is a determination on the part of some campaigners, Community Land Scotland, John Muir Trust, but also the governmental organisation, the Scottish Land Commission, to drive forward, to make changes, to make sure that land is managed in the public interest. The big landed estates are managed in the public interest and for community benefit. I think what is lacking at the moment is, we would certainly welcome this land reform bill, but we think there needs to be a lot more precise detail put in. What do we mean by the public interest exactly? How do we ensure that land management plans are designed to benefit communities, to divest, in some cases, big landowners of the land that they own, and that their control is diversified so that communities and others can have access to land. These details are still not yet clear based on consultation that's been opened up now. We support the direction of travel. We'd like to see more detail, and we'd like to see perhaps a bit more radicalism in some areas. For example, the focus of the land reform bill is on estates over 3,000 hectares. Now that's huge, and that only involves 350 or so estates. We would like to see it to be as a minimum of 1,000 hectares or lower, but 1,000 hectares, which is something like 4 times the size of the Holyrood Park, which includes Arthur's Seat and the Crags and various lochs. It's something like 7 times the size of Pollock Country Park. And so by anybody's calculations, 1,000 hectares is huge. And that's one of the things that we would like, we certainly are pushing in that, along with Community Land Scotland and others. But generally, we're supportive of the direction of travel. There's a financial problem at the heart of this. There's a big problem of economics. I'll stop talking now, but maybe Ailsa.
Because I wanted to take up the issue of community land ownership. But Ailsa, how does that fit into the need for land reform? How far can community land ownership go in replacing the current structures?
It can go quite a long way. So I think what's good about the current land reform bill is it recognises, perhaps for the first time, that actually Scotland's land is a resource for everybody, and therefore they're introducing this concept of the public interest. And that if you're a big landowner, and I agree with Alan that JMT are at 1,000 hectares, we're at 500 hectares. But if you own big chunks of land, then you must be able to demonstrate that you're holding that in the public interest. So you're delivering things for the wider outcomes in Scotland, not just personal wealth. So I think that's really important about the current land reform bill. It could be more radical, and we're obviously pushing for more to go in there around what the public interest test will look like, and things like notifications of sales to get away from this sort of dark market approach we have at the minute. But we're also keen to see communities given some additional powers to be able to acquire land, and it's helpful to know that that is in the bill, that there is a presumption that communities will be able to acquire more land, because they've proven that when they do acquire big tracts of land, like Egg, where I am, that I'm the chair of, or Gear, or Golson, or Knoydart, or Carlaway, or any of these places, that actually they start building houses, they start increasing the population again, they bring back young people, they create jobs, that all the wealth that's generated from the renewables or other schemes goes back into the local economy and is not extracted. So there's a great argument for community ownership, but we have to recognise, communities everywhere don't want to own everything. So in those places where community ownership is not an option for various reasons, then we need organisations like John Muir Trust or the Woodland Trust or other organisations like that to work together with the communities to ensure that as much as possible of that wealth stays locally and jobs are created locally and housing is created locally. And if it's a big private landowner, then they work with the community, so the communities have some say in decisions around what happens on the land and can also share from the benefits of it. So there's a whole spectrum of opportunity here, and I think the bill is thinking about that, but it needs to go further.
I want to turn it back in the last few minutes that we've got to the issue of land and the environment and climate change and so forth. You mentioned the carbon sequestration. I mean, how do you see, Ailsa, community land ownership fitting into the challenges that need to be taken up in terms of using the land as a part of a strategy for confronting climate change?
Well, community landowners are showing they're doing it already. They've been in this game for a long time. So it's not just about planting trees and sequestering carbon and selling offsets. I mean, some communities are a bit sceptical about the whole offset market because they don't think there's sufficient regulation around it. But, they're contributing hugely by either restoring peatland or planting trees. But, behaviour change is going to be absolutely critical to addressing climate change. And communities are really good at changing that local behaviour in terms of recycling, reuse, insulation, new passive house standards when they're building houses, active travel, electric car charging points, all of these things that are absolutely critical to changing the way that we as a society function. It's not just about planting trees and restoring peatland, and yet that's where most of the activity seems to be. I think that's what communities are really good at. They see that much broader picture and they're in it for the long term. So they're not going to be in and out. They're not going to get in, plant the trees, sell the carbon offsets and clear off. They're in it for 100 years. They're thinking about what their children and their children's children are going to be doing with this land. So I think in some respects, the way that communities approach this is the long-term sustainable solution because it's not driven by finance. That's the problem we have at the moment.
Alan?
Yes, totally agree with that. I think you can broadly divide Scotland's land ownership sector into 4 areas. One is public land, which is government-owned land mainly, Scottish government-owned land, the forest estate, National Forest Estate, some national nature reserves and so on. You have the community land sector, which Ailsa has spoken about. You have environmental NGOs, John Muir Trust, RSPB, other environmental organisations on land, and then you have the private sector. The first 3, public, community and environmental NGOs, try to manage land in the public interest to the best of their ability. Sometimes it's difficult because you can be surrounded by private sporting estates that make it difficult to manage an oasis of land for environmental benefit. But broadly, they operate in the public interest. The big problem is in the private sector, which is a vast majority of Scotland's rural land. And the private sector, to be fair, some private landowners are exemplary in terms of the ecological standards. They manage not just ecological, but they manage land in the public interest for communities, for jobs, for climate, for nature, and they're good, but they are hugely outnumbered. They're now outnumbered something like 1 to 10 in terms of 10 to 1 in terms of Scotland's broad land mass by sporting estates, by landowners who manage their land for deer and grouse, essentially, for a niche sport whose total participants would hardly fit into Inverness Cayley Stadium on a Saturday afternoon, and yet something like 40,000 square kilometres of Scotland's land is managed for that primary purpose, and that brings with it huge environmental degradation, overgrazing, burning, stripping of vegetation, everything, and it creates very few jobs. It does create some jobs, and these jobs are important to these that have them, but it prevents other things happening with that land that would be much more beneficial. So that's part of land reform, tackling that whole area, and fortunately that is happening alongside the land reform bill. There's other legislation coming through in relation to deer management, how deer are managed, which will impact on sporting estates, and how grouse moors are managed, which will impact also on another part of the sporting estate culture. So there is positive things happening, but we'll see how things unfold over the next few years.
I certainly hope to take up that issue of sporting estates and so on and so forth more specifically, maybe in a future one of these programs. But just as a final point, you mentioned, we talked about carbon offsets and carbon sequestration and so on and so forth, and the problems with that from your point of view. And of course, the climate justice movement, to a considerable extent, also has big criticisms of that, because it's seen as a way of simply allowing fossil fuel companies to keep on doing business as usual kind of thing and pretending that they're solving the problem when they're not. But I wanted to ask you, also mentioned the issue of renewables, and that's obviously, it's a huge issue, and we can't go into the big deal in a lot of detail now. But what is currently, and what could be in the future, the role of a reformed land sector with all those three sectors, and particularly community land ownership, in terms of renewables? If we don't want just massive wind farms, owned by European energy companies or any other energy company for that matter, what's the community alternative in terms of, an alternative to fossil fuel energies, basically?
Well, there's been some really interesting studies, Ian, which shows that community-owned renewable energy returns 34 times the amount of local benefit to communities as opposed to private. So even private, whether it's hydro or wind or solar, there's such a small return locally to the people that are impacted by it. Whereas if a community owns the infrastructure itself, all of the wealth that's generated comes back to that local community. So in the first instances, you get communities much more on board with it, because they can see that not only the sort of the environmental, the climate benefits of going down this route, but actually all of the wealth and income from it is not being soaked out of the local economy, and it's coming back into the economy. So there's quite a lot of interest from communities, and they're doing this all over the place. They're looking at developing their own hydro and solar schemes. So on Egg, I already mentioned, we've got a combined hydro, solar and wind scheme, which we're currently upgrading, and we've been producing our own renewable energy because we're off the grid for a very long time now, as has Canna, as has Fair Isle, as has some of the other communities around Scotland. So communities can think a bit more long term, they can think a bit out of the box, but we do need more support for them to do it.
Great. Okay, we've almost out of time. I don't know if you want to add anything final there, Alan?
Yeah, just the only thing is that when we look at carbon sequestration and carbon markets and the potential money that could come in to some of the most sparsely populated parts of rural Scotland, we need to learn the lessons of what's happened in the renewable sector. So something that benefited the climate and had a positive role to play in decarbonising the electricity sector was stitched up basically by big energy companies and big landowners. The model was build them huge, build them massive, build them across big landscapes, and that meant dealing with the biggest private landowners who enriched, made a lot of money, and that drove up land prices. Communities, as Ailsa says, were squeezed out of that whole process. And one of the things the Scottish government has to do, and society as a whole has to do, is regulate the carbon sequestration process much more rigorously and make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. We do something that might be of benefit to the climate, but it's done in a way that benefits the wealthy and it does not contribute to a just transition, which needs to involve social justice as well as environmental justice. The renewable onshore wind in particular has been really double-edged, and one edge of that has been extremely damaging both to communities and also even to landscapes and ecosystems. So that's something we need to be wary of in the future.
There's a lot more to talk about. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much to both of you, and I hope people will, learn a bit from that and feed people's interest in finding out more about the issues in Scotland's land. Thank you very much. That's Alan McCombes from the John Muir Trust, Ailsa Raeburn from Community Land Scotland. That's all we have time for now. Until the next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Thank you.
Helping